So our talk today, this is Brian, I'm Nat, is going to be about English as the linguistic bully of the 21st century. And I think it's probably fair to say that we'll be talking from the standpoint that it is the linguistic bully, but we'll be talking about the why and what languages are doing to counteract this effect. So we'll just talk you quickly through the outline of the talk. And we're going to be talking about, well, we're going to be discussing initially three main reasons that English has come to be a bullying language, which we identify as historical reasons, geographical and maybe political reasons, as well as socio-cultural reasons. And we're also putting in a bit of linguistic reasoning, which is perhaps a little debatable, but we think is worth discussing.
Right. So we've. Sorry, do you hear me? Yes. So we've gone through. Prepared a nice sample of things to look at for today. Starting with. So trends. Okay, let's look at trends because we're all about trends. We're looking at the regions and basically the languages that are most affected by English, the ones that are being bullied the most. Let's say. The vocabulary that are most affected, which areas or which words, which domains, and the areas of society most affected. Is it people who are educated, people who are studying a foreign language, people who are younger, older? Look at that. Okay, and yes, thank you.
And I've gone loud again, sorry. And we'll be hypothesizing that there are three main sort of potential outcomes of the bullying effect. Firstly, that languages can actually go completely extinct because of the enormous pressure from English. Secondly, that there may be some sort of compromise where an element of English gets incorporated, either pretty much as it is or maybe conforms to certain rules of the language, or that some languages actually successfully manage to completely reject English.
Thanks. Okay, so the last part is the borrowings at the bottom. So we're looking at different types of languages that borrow English, how they incorporate these words into their vocabulary. For example, you have a pure borrowing, which is like the word taxi in Malay, which becomes taxi, or microphone in Chinese, and pairoto in Japanese, basi in Swahili, and I can't read Thai, so I assume that's sex. Yeah, sex in Thai. There's a calque. Who knows what a calque is? It's a French word, yes. It's a French word, it's a borrowing. It means basically a word that is translated from the roots of that language, but to use it to apply to a foreign concept. So the concept of canal or channel, meaning a channel with water flowing through, which became the word for channel, as in TV channel and now YouTube channel. In Arabic, it's a qana. So a qana is in fact a channel that's dug into the ground or an aqueduct, and it now means YouTube channel. If you hear qanawat in Arabic, it means channels. As you find in social media, for example, and that's a calque. Lune de miel, of course, honeymoon from French, which is directly translated from the English, and you have bulan madu, if you're learning Indonesian, which literally means honeymoon. Yes, and herunterladen, or to download from German, which is basically, so you're looking at a word that's used by the borrowing language, words that are purely from the borrowing language that have been adapted to express a concept from the donor language, if that makes sense. Okay, thank you. Right.
Okay, so we'll just talk quickly through the settings for this concept. So obviously, on the historical side, we have the British Empire, obviously responsible for pushing English into an enormous number of countries in the world, with the sad effect in certain cases, for example, in North America, of actually pushing indigenous languages to extinction.
Yes, and if we're looking at the many countries that have been under the British Empire, for example, English was and to a very, very large extent still is the language of governance. So in Nigeria, for example, everything official is in English, despite the hundreds of languages they speak there. So English still has a very, very strong impact for historical reasons. Yeah.
There's also quite an interesting effect from World War II, which I think is probably quite influential in establishing America as a global power, and obviously the effect of having left some troops behind in certain countries. Japan, I think, being an example. So there's a sort of a continuation of English in areas which, possibly may not have happened otherwise. It's probably obviously worth saying these are just a few historical reasons. It would be an entirely other talk to talk about everything involved in the history of English. Sorry.
Thank you. So, my turn. Yes, the history of the English language. Let's go way back to the 200 BC, about-ish, when English was not spoken in England. So the original languages, whatever they were going back tens of thousands of years, were replaced by Indo-European languages. So that the one that get is we have Celtic, the P Celtic and the Q Celtic. We'll not go into that. But the Celtic languages, of course, were eventually pushed north by the invading Roman Empire, and the ones that remained behind became partially Latinized. So the early part of the first millennium, basically, there was a very, very strong Roman influence in the south of the UK, south of England, and probably extending into Wales and a little bit of Scotland as well. This was, of course, then replaced. The language was, to a very, very large extent, replaced by the Germanic invasions, the Anglo-Saxons, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, who came from the part between northern Germany, Friesland, and Denmark, that little triangle area, bringing forth the Germanic language that became Anglo-Saxon. Okay. And people always forget that English isn't entirely Anglo-Saxon. It has a very, very large Viking component, a very large Scandinavian component. I think the word for sky is from Old Norse. The word for leg, I think, and things like that. Very, very common words come from Old Norse. And they come from basically this period. And I think the further north you go in England, the more Scandinavian words you find in the local dialects. It gets further north. Which makes sense. Okay, and so this mixture of languages, English, Old English, which is basically West Germanic, Old Norse, Northern Germanic, which sort of mixed together and became what we know as Old English, was then influenced by French. But it's not the French of Paris, it was the French spoken by the Norman invaders from Normandy. So a lot of the vocabulary that comes from English, many of them actually have two or three different variations, like the word for war. Because in Norman French, the gu sound became a W, so like war was like were or something, warrior or something, and guerrier, which is in Parisian French, that kept the G sound. So a guardian and a warden come from the same source, for example, but in different dialects, and were borrowed at different times. Warden came during the Anglo-Norman period, and later on, towards the Renaissance, the word gardien, came in from Parisian French. So yeah, that's history. So English was basically influenced by Latin at least 3 times, or had 3 layers of influence. The Anglo-Saxon period was, of course, a lot of the Christian terminology in Anglo-Saxon were calques from Latin or Greek or something during the very early period. And then you have the Norman French period coming in. Right? And then you've got the Renaissance. During the later period, you've got the Renaissance. So this is interesting because after the Renaissance, basically, between the 1500 to 1800, that's when early modern English developed, if you look at the lower chart. So you've got Old English, which is Beowulf and all that. Middle English, which after the influence of the Norman French came in, we developed, the English language developed into something recognizably English, and it's the language of Chaucer, the Canterbury Tales, right? And then you have Shakespeare's English, which is early modern English, and then modern English from the 1800s onwards. Yeah. All right. So that little bit at the end, which is the Celtic remnants, that's debatable. I don't know if the ing part actually comes from whether it's a calque from the Celtic use of the participle to show the present tense. I'm not sure, but and the do maybe. Place names, definitely. There are a lot of place names in the UK that are of Celtic origin, even though they're not spoken in Celtic areas now. Okay. Yeah, I think so.
And moving on to a few of the geographical and political reasons that English has become, a bullying language. So English, obviously, we just had a really interesting talk on this for anyone who was in the room previously. But English obviously has this interesting feature that it's not really owned by native speakers. think probably the last statistic of the first point, the billion L2 speakers, is probably debatable. It's probably quite a bit bigger than that. But certainly in terms of proportions, this gives you an idea of how many UK native speakers of English there are compared to globally and L2 speakers, which I suppose you could say gives it a certain amount of flexibility because it is owned by everyone. It can be used in different ways. It can be sort of mashed around a fair bit on a global scale.
All right. So so continuing from what Nat said, for example, extremely influential areas where English has gained a foothold. The Indian subcontinent, during the British Raj, English became entrenched, replacing earlier languages. Maybe it was Persian, or in the south it was one of the southern Indian languages. It became the lingua franca in a very, very diverse region. In India, I guess because there's so many languages spoken in India, it's just logical to speak English. English has a very high status in modern Indian society, I guess. Again, that's from the Raj. The southern hemisphere, all along the trade routes, basically from South Africa, all the way across to Australia and New Zealand, you have English speakers, English settlers. That was also historical reasons from the late 18th century to the 19th century and early 20th century. You've got immigrants, mainly English-speaking immigrants, but of course from elsewhere as well, increasing the number of speakers of various varieties of English in the southern hemisphere. Yeah.
We also find there's sometimes a conscious choice to move into English or to adopt English. And just a couple of examples. Rwanda, for example, about 10 years ago, I think, switched from French to English in its schools, partly as a move, apparently, towards the future of business. Thought English would be possibly a more useful language, but also as a comment on the French-speaking regime under the genocide. This was a sort of attempt to move away from the past and to make a comment on the usage of the French language. The University of Pretoria apparently has moved from Afrikaans to English for various reasons, but one of them to be a bit more inclusive, as English is possibly a bit more of a lingua franca in South Africa, and again as a comment on the previous regime. And as we all learnt in the World Cup in 2018, the Belgian football team apparently communicates in English. Again, partly so as not to sort of show any favoritism to any particular language in a country which obviously is linguistically quite diverse. And of course, I mean, the world of finance, obviously English is fairly instrumental in that.
So going back to the Belgian football team, any Belgians to confirm that? Okay. So, well, interesting, but good to know. Okay, interesting. So the last point, the official language of many international bodies, of course, one of the languages would be English. There may be others, English, maybe French, Spanish, but English is definitely used in the WHO, the UNESCO, UNICEF. A lot of proceedings are in English. It's definitely entrenched as one of the major languages, in the world. Yes. Sorry. There we go. So, socio-cultural reasons. Yes. So pop culture. Yes, everybody loves pop culture, I think. Yes. So the influence of pop culture, American pop culture, is very pervasive everywhere. And I think we'll talk further on, but so when I say pop culture, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. I'm not much of a pop culture fan, so let's just go on. So basically, global news. Next point. New York Times, BBC, and CNN. So these are major vehicles for information that that are almost always presented in English. So English has become a language where if you have access to it, you have access to information. That in many parts of the world, this is the trend that's going on. And English is cool. Do you think English is cool? No. Yes. So Nat, correct me if this is Big Tasty. I don't read Russian, but yeah, and that's yes, we go business lunch. I think that's are those brands or?
I think the Big Tasty might be a sort of Big Mac in Russia. I think.
Okay, so it's cool to use English words for for fast food and So French fast food chain, there's Quick if you live in France, and fare lo shopping. Do you say that in Italian? I think so. Yes. Yeah. So. Yeah. Unfortunately, thank you. Unfortunately, thank you. Yes, confirmed. So so this is it's. I won't call it a disease, but it's not a disease, but it's something that's becoming more and more trendy to use. It's to use English everywhere, pretty much. Yeah, thanks.
The sort of diversity and wealth of literature written in English obviously has had a huge effect as well. And I think the invention of the printing press fairly early on was have helped to sort of push written English out across the world. And obviously, the Bible was a fairly important piece of literature that in fact we'll look at this later with Cornish, but I think the pushing English through the medium of written religion has really promoted English across the world. English, I think, has often been seen as a fairly prestige language. For example, at the moment, there's in Scotland there's a sort of program called I Can Speak Scots, I written A-Y-E, as in yes in the Scots language, which is trying to, I think it's trying to sort of help Scots speakers realise that they speak Scots and take a pride in it, because historically it's been seen as maybe a dialect of English or something which possibly they shouldn't speak compared to Scottish Standard English. I think actually in Wales, Welsh only became compulsory in the curriculum for under 14s in the 1990s, so that's quite late really. Obviously in education across the world we see that English is very often a medium of instruction, both at university level and at lower levels. It's the language of computer coding for the most part, and also in sport, from the Olympics to tennis to skiing, it's very often a language which is very dominant. And we'll see in the effects of basketball.
Right, okay, so, can you see this? Yes. Yes. Who speaks a language where basketball isn't basketball? Oh, thank you.
Ooh.
Oh, yes. Okay, so I guess you're from Poland. Let me see. Hungarian speakers are probably, Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Montenegro, I guess, right? Greece, yes, and Russians say basketball. So, yeah. And Finnish, and of course the famous, the Italian and the Spanish speakers, yes. I guess that's about it. Any other exceptions? Sorry, where are you from? You're Irish, are you? Okay, so you've got, what's Irish for basketball?
Yes.
That's fascinating. Interesting. Yes. Oh, good. Okay, so there's okay. And Icelandic, any Icelandic speakers around? There we go. Yes, basketball. Yes. Very interesting. So this is the languages that follow the trend and languages that buck the trend. So Icelandic is one of them. They're very, very creative with ways ways not to sound English, I guess. Mm. Yeah, that's one of the languages. All right. Great. Yes.
We see a very similar thing with football. Unfortunately, we were unable to zoom in very well on Europe, where obviously there is a little bit of variation, but you can see globally football is very often football. Of course, Italian is an exception. What else is an exception? Oh, of course, America. Yes. Yeah, we did look into that actually, and soccer I think comes from, is actually sort of an abbreviation of association football, is that right? Something like that, so it's kind of comes from football, but not quite. Yeah.
And the Japanese one is soccer. And literally Chinese is literally football or leg ball. Yeah, it's literally in China, yeah.
Which one?
Which one? Oh,
Germany.
Yes.
Where is?
That's the problem. Is used. Oh yes. What does it say?
What is it in German? Fußball. Right, but German.
Right.
Yes.
Yes. So it's a calque. It's a German words used to express football, but it's translated from English. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yes. And yes. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. I'm sorry.
So the other reason English might have become so prominent in the world is because English has a relatively simple grammar as a relative. Yeah. So there's no nominal gender. It's rare for a European language not to have gender. English is one of the exceptions. I think the other Indo-European language is probably Persian, major one that has lost gender. It's got English has very few irregular verbs. They exist, but not as common, and very little inflection. Go, going, gone, and went, but something like that. No cases, So that's a very, very simplified language compared to maybe Russian or Greek or other European languages.
Similarly, quite a simple orthography. If you compare I can't actually remember how many letters in the English alphabet. How embarrassing! 26? Is it 6? 26. Letters compared to I think Khmer has 73 or something like that. It's there aren't really diacritics. It's comparatively simple. I hope you agree.
Yes, and English also is very, very open to borrowing loanwords from other languages. Chocolate, which is from Nahuatl. Avocado, which it doesn't mean lawyer, it comes from the Nahuatl word aguacatl, which means the origins is the word testicle, because of the resemblance of the the fruit. And use your imagination. But yes. So I don't want to spoil your appetite every time you look at an avocado, but that's the etymology. Tsunami from Japan, judo, guitar, shampoo. Where does shampoo come from? Hindi, is it?
Hindi, I believe. Is that right? We think?
I think so, yes. And coyote from Nahuatl, yeah. Okay.
It's also, obviously English was, again, comparatively standardized at a fairly early stage. I think by the 15th century there was a version of English which people were relatively, comfortable with, which can be an advantage with languages because it sort of means there's no infighting between different sort of dialects who are all vying for being the version, which is something we see with Cornish, where there are, many different versions and, at least 3 sort of prestige dialects which sort of stopped there being a sort of standardized Cornish for quite a long time.
And English has a very, very large vocabulary. I forget how many. Does anybody know how many words English has in the dictionaries? A couple 100,000 or something? No? It's huge. Sorry.
Wow. Gosh.
And it's very open to borrowing. Probably because the history of English, it's been a fairly mixed language from the beginning, and so English is quite receptive to borrowing, right? Like I said, everybody knows what edamame is, right? Kimchi. Yeah. So there we go. So this came in through the food industry, and it became commonplace. I think you say. Let me think of some neologisms and new words in English. What do you say? To ship something. Mm-hmm. I ship that. Do you say that? From relationship, I think. Ah. I think so. It's relationship to ship, and that's new. That was coined within the last 10 years or something. It's new. Yeah, and people say it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, English is everywhere. Yes. Household brands in Japan and Vietnam. So I've never been to Japan for a very, very long time. Vietnam only recently, but yes. You will find these brand names in Japan quite commonly. Hoover, Band-Aid, Frisbee. And it's actually more prestigious to use an English-sounding name or something that vaguely sounds English to make it more posh, more popular, more modern. English actually borrowed a few of these sort of Japanese coined words back, like Walkman was in the 80s, was invented in Japan, and they went back into the UK, went back to America and the UK. Yes, interesting enough. Yes.
I'm not sure if I should have put Kiwi under consumer products in hindsight. So I don't know what I was thinking, but the point of this really is that there are a lot of sort of, commercial products which are exported around the world, and whilst it may a number of these may not be English words in themselves, in a lot of cases they have been sort of transported through the medium of English. And obviously a lot of these are brand names, as Brian has said. Oh, sorry. Obviously, social media as well. We have a large amount of vocabulary that is from English and in a lot of languages, hasn't really been changed. Obviously because it's very rapid usage that people need. So immediately English is going to get borrowed. I think also a lot of the programs we use for social media don't necessarily support a lot of languages. So off the top of my head, I think Snapchat, for example, supports about 20 languages, which in the great scheme of the languages in the world isn't that many.
Now, pop culture terminology in Southeast Asia. This is an interesting topic. Thailand was never really conquered by any European country. It was the only country in Southeast Asia not colonized by either the UK, the Netherlands, France, Spain, you know. Right. But they are getting, if you read magazines, if you watch TV programs, there's more and more English creeping in. I don't read Thai, but yes, I assume, you know, violin, film, TV. Valentine's Day, I've heard this, is very common in Thai. Indonesian slang, if you're learning Indonesian, do not use this slang unless you want to sound really colloquial, and yes, your teacher might say, who taught you this? One way to make a verb out of any noun is to put ng in front of it. So you can use it with pretty much any word in any language. So in this case, English, date, date, to go on a date, cafe, ngafe, to go to coffee and have a coffee. Go to a coffee shop to have a coffee. Yeah. Drugs, drug, or drug. To take drugs. It's very current. So I saw this in actually, it was a religious newspaper or something like that, or online, that says, yeah, does taking drugs make you happy? Drug begin happy. Yeah, so like, you know, even that, you see, has been, yes, it's become very hip or posh to use English. Yeah.
And in the world of transport, as well as English being, again, a medium of international shipping and air traffic control, we find that some individual words are very, very prevalent in a huge number of languages, having been borrowed from English. And what we've done, yes, sorry, so we're just going to have a quick look at the word taxi. What we've done here is we've taken, I actually can't count exactly how many, but it's something like between about 120 words for taxi from our uTalk app. And we've looked at how basically bunched together all the ones that say something like taxi, and then at the bottom you see the proportion of ones which say something that is nothing like taxi. So just to show you how, you know, it's not a very scientific experiment, but just to show you from about 120 quite popular world languages, which ones have sort of bucked the trend. I don't know how many of these we can name at the bottom. Icelandic we have first.
Is it Samoan?
It is Samoan, next.
Yes. I can't remember, what was that?
We have Chinese in the middle.
There's Chinese, yes. Yes, Chinese. Tamil.
I think we have Hebrew at the end, hopefully.
Hebrew at the end, yes.
And
is this
Shona?
Afrikaans? No.
Afrikaans.
No.
I think it's Norwegian.
Oh, Norwegian. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I've done this in a really odd order. Do we have Malayalam in the... Is it Malayalam? And Shona, just before the end.
Shona was the end, yes.
So,
yes.
quite interesting. And we see, we've done this for a couple of... sorry, was that a question?
Sorry.
No, I'm just pointing out, you say English, but in English, like in New York, you say catch a cab.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
No, that's a very good point. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's very true. And what? Yeah, I think. Yeah. It's a good point actually. I'm surprised, to be honest, that something like cab hasn't appeared on this a bit more, because you'd think from the American it might have come up.
Interesting one, yeah. I think cab is a very new. When did it come current in the US? Quite recently, I think.
Don't know. Very good question.
Yeah.
I mean, there are. I think a Norwegian speaker may confirm this, but I think drosje is possibly to do with a sort of carriage. Is that right? Oh, it comes from Russian. Oh, really interesting.
Russian had an own word for taxi until 1971.
Ah, yes.
Kraftdroschke.
Kraftdroschke. Ah, right. So that's the same.
1971.
Right, and then it became taxi. Very interesting. Taxi. Sorry, taxi. That's it.
Taxi really originated from English or from French?
Well, that's a very good question. I actually don't know, but I think it certainly is pushed through English a lot. But does anyone know if it's originally from French or from Latin? Yes. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Yes. We see a very similar thing. Well, we've done the same thing with the word jeans. Oh, sorry, Brian. Sorry. My fault. Sorry. Sorry, jeans. So again, now with this one, we've actually, obviously a higher proportion of, again, languages that buck the trend. I mean, to be completely honest, some of these, I think, possibly include things which come from a slightly different interpretation of genes, like cowboys, I think, is a fairly common sort of way of describing genes in certain languages. But again, we see Icelandic is here with I can't pronounce it very well, but Gallabuxer? I'm getting a thumbs up, thank you. We have Greenlandic, I think is Korput. Down here, we've got all sorts of interesting languages here. And lastly, we're looking at the telephone to sort of show the technological one. And here again, we've got something, even a lot more similarity actually in the word telephone. But then again, we see, what have we got? We've got Finnish is bucking the trend. We've got, I'm sure, Icelandic as well. Which one is that? Is that Icelandic? Simi? Arabic.
Yeah,
we have, sorry.
A lot of the Chinese influenced languages, Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, they use something like Tianhua, or something similar to that from Chinese. Yeah.
Yes. So we can see basically that there is a big influence. And we're also just very quickly looking at, so I think with these sort of examples we've talked about, quite often it's a thing that has been introduced, possibly because, again, like there's sort of a need for something, for vocab in a very rapid way. But we're going to look at a few other examples where I think English has ended up being adopted over time more for simplicity. So, for example, here we have the Tumbuka language, which has its own numbers, and you can see them 1 to 10 and then 15 and 20. They would use Tumbuka numbers. But generally speaking, above 20, we find that English just gets used. And this is because there's quite a complicated amount of maths that is needed to render Tumbuka numbers over that, over 20. You would have to start saying sort of 5 plus 1 plus 10, and it all gets a bit much. Similarly with Chichewa, which is a language very closely related to Tumbuka, we see for the time, generally they tend to use English time, because again, the maths involved in telling the time in Chichewa is just, it would take too much time to do it. Similarly with month names, quite often these get borrowed from English, and I think obviously there are a lot of languages where the sort of 12-month calendar is not necessarily how people would normally talk in their language about about the progress of the year. So in those cases, English may be borrowed. With colours as well, I think this may be slightly more to do with the fact that colours can be sort of added to languages as and when needed, and there's some quite interesting studies on that. But here we can see, again, these may not all be from English exactly, some of them may be through perhaps Afrikaans or German maybe, but we see, pink, pingy. Fijian is pinky, this Q is pronounced as sort of nk. So different reasons, I think, behind incorporating English.
Yes, to add this one, the dark blue one, because a lot of languages don't have a separate word for blue or from green. So blue and green might be the same word actually, or same word. So in recent times, due to the influence of English, let's have a word for blue. And so blue came into Swahili and Igbo and all. In the Malay language, the word for blue now is biru, which probably, I'm not sure whether it comes from blue or from an older root, but it used to be nila from Sanskrit. So the concept of color as well was influenced by other languages as well, but it came in. Yeah. So okay. Oh yes, the hybrid languages. Yes, I heard a lot of this morning, but the last couple of days as well. Franglais, yes. How many French speakers say relooking? Ouais, voilà. Les Parisiens, relooking. Le Fooding is a website, I think. Yes, very popular. Je suis, pardon, there's a spelling mistake. It's je suis with an S. Worn out. Brunch. Bruncher, no, it's not as current. Okay. So tweeter, like it, yeah, with the FB, Facebook posts, yes, very, very common. And jogging, yes, tracksuit bottoms, yes. Which one wears to faire un footing. And remember, take close to le pressing. Yeah. Yes, very, very common. I think anything with an ing at the back sounds vaguely English. I think French people overdo it sometimes, and it sounds a bit strange. for native speakers. Yeah, okay.
Has anyone heard of the Chiac language in Canada? A version of Arcadian French, which really clashes English and French together a lot, and will take an English word and Frenchify it with a French verb ending. So you end up with things like José and Woke, quite interesting. English, obviously, sort of there's a mixing up of English and Hindi. So we see things like many thanks, G, I think being kind of like a term of respect, I believe. You can prepone a meeting, which is something you can't really. In British English, you probably wouldn't do. Stop acting jungly means sort of stop acting wild. I believe from jungle, which obviously is a Hindi word. Apparently, it can be a little bit not offensive, but it's a little bit towards that side of the scale, apparently. So.
Just to add to the Chiac, I just remembered. I think I heard a speaker once on YouTube. It's weird because they use very English words with very, very old French grammar and pronunciation. So, like, for example, they pronounce like very rural French dialects, the R. So, grande maison or something like that. They have R, not R, but R, like in many rural French dialects. They also use, I think, English in a very, very peculiar mix. Yes, and yeah, so that's, remember. Okay, so last one is the Singlish. Oh, sorry, yes. Yes, who is from Singapore, who has been to Singapore? Who has talked with Singaporeans or Malaysians? Exactly. So yes, then you know what I'm talking about. Why are you so kepo? Means why are you such a busybody? Kepo being a Minnan, Taiwanese, Southeast Chinese word for busybody. It comes from something like chicken and lady or female chicken, something. Yeah. Yes. Let's go tapao dinner. Let's have a takeaway for dinner. Sorry lah. Very common in Malaysia, Singapore. I drop your phone. So paiseh. Paiseh meaning 不好意思 in Taiwanese dialect, yes, or Fujian dialect, yes, right.
So as we said, one of the sad effects of this is that languages can be pushed to extinction. I mean, the indigenous languages of the UK have, in some cases suffered that, and in others been very marginalised for a number of reasons, but essentially because of sort of gradual invasion of English into sort of all areas of life. Also, as we sort of said earlier, a lack of literature in that language has sort of meant that it can't be used to quite the same extent, or again in all the aspects of life that English can be. For example, in Cornwall, there was never any translation of the Common Book of Prayer into Cornish. It was only in English, so when people went to church, they had to use English as the medium, of interaction, which took away a part of their, well, obviously their culture. Of course, as well as emigration, so that's people who spoke the indigenous languages moving away for various reasons. We also see immigration of English speakers moving into those areas. The Elementary Education Act in England and Wales made English the official medium of instruction in schools. And we also see these very sad techniques in schools. For example, the Welsh not in Ireland, I think the Batascoir, probably pronouncing that wrong, sorry. And in Brittany, La Vache, where basically children would end up with this, I don't know, stick or something if they spoke in their native language, and at the end of the day would basically get beaten with the stick unless they successfully managed to pass it on to another child who was speaking the language.
Yes, and in North America and also in Australia, most of the native languages are either extinct, endangered, or, well, between seriously endangered. We've got, so some of those at the top list, those are no longer being spoken. The others are seriously endangered, between 1 and 10 speakers, maybe. And Australian languages. Okay, so Australian languages are interesting. So some of them are actually sort of evolving in the pressure with English coming in. So Warlpiri is interesting because many younger speakers are sort of mixing English and Warlpiri and creating a new language with grammar that's different from both. So it's called light Warlpiri, or Warlpiri Rambagu. That's what they call it, and it has new structure. So maybe that's the future. How things will go. Yep.
So in our last 5 minutes, we'll just move on to the sort of again, the efforts of and effects on these languages, and to concentrate again, we'll return again to the UK, because we're now in a much more positive situation, thanks to a lot of people who've been trying to revive the language very actively. But it's interesting, I mean, Manx, for example, is a language which is surrounded by English speakers. It's been revived by English native speakers. So we may ask, why isn't it more peppered with English loanwords? That would seem a natural assumption. And they've got a variety of ways of ensuring this doesn't happen. One of them is that they actually have a very, they're quite an old translation of the Bible, which contains a lot of words. So when they need to find a new word in Manx, which is being partly recreated, we could say, some of the vocabulary has been lost forever, they tend to look back to the Bible and also to the sister language Irish to see if there's something they can borrow from that. So for example, the Manx word for jellyfish, smúgráin, is actually taken from the Irish, and apparently literally means seal snot. Nice. Sorry. We see, again, we sort of talked about the concept of prestige language. In fact, we've mentioned it twice because we're so... No, sorry, that's a typo. It's only meant to say that once. But we see people can now feel more comfortable, I think, talking their language in both informal and formal situations. With Cornish, we actually have the Academy Cernuic, which strives to create new vocabulary, and we've actually included a little excerpt from their methodology, which shows that they obviously go to, if they need a new word, they go to the Cornish corpus first to see if there's anything that they can sort of reinvent from that. If not, then Welsh and Breton are the next languages they look to, obviously being the closest Celtic languages, and then they will look to English. So there's a real effort to not go to English first. With Hawaiian, we have the Hawaiian Lexicon Committee, which meets several times a year to discuss new words they need in the language. You could submit a proposal for a word that you think is needed, and they come up with enormous lists of things. These are just a few that we've included. Autumn, avocado is a sort of Mexican pear, attic is a ceiling room. So again, very concerted effort to use something Hawaiian if possible.
So with Greenlandic, there's an actually increasing number of speakers. It's one of the more vibrant native languages in North America. So there's a lot of Danish influence, but the language is evolving to a point where they don't need that many loanwords anymore. The language is very, very creative when it comes. But I don't really speak Greenlandic, so but check it out. Navajo is very, very resistant to borrowing from English. Even the words for kangaroo, which in many language is kangaroo, is actually Nahate'ito, which means the big thing that hops around, basically. And Australia is the kangaroo country. Yes, and then you got things like that, yes. Interesting one is the word for telephone, the metal with which stories are told. Besh be hane. And na kide, which means the thing that moves with your eyes or in front of your eyes is a movie. And the nishche na kide means the air movie, or the movie that gets transmitted through the atmosphere. Yes, so it's, new words. I'm going to go speed up very quickly. And we've got Alutiiq, Walbury's, these are the languages. You could check these online for more information about them. Walbury has borrowed a lot of English and is evolving gradually. Yes. And so you want
yes, and then we have a few other examples of languages which, slightly different interpretations. So Igbo, we see, does tend to borrow quite a lot, but it will often quite try to sort of subject the English word into its own spelling. Icelandic, we've already mentioned, has a system of linguistic purism, which I think began in the 1800s to try to reject too many Danish loanwords, but now obviously English is the bully, probably more than Danish, so we can see some interesting versions here with a very rough translation of how they came about and what they mean. So, journey and phone for mobile and. Sorry.
I think we'll just skip through because we're a bit out of time. Let's see the next slides, I think. Yep, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.